Oh, hi, Senator Mitchell. Thank you so much for coming.
And I'm sorry I'm late. My personal friend was just appointed to the state's Supreme Court. And so I was
Wow.
on the phone with the administration. So
Oh,
forgive me
wow.
for being a few minutes late.
The
That's a
best.
big deal.
It's the best reason I've ever heard for someone being late. Don't worry. Great.
Marty
So
Jenkins was just appointed to the Supreme Court for California. So it's a good day.
Wow. Amazing. Cool. I think we should, I'll start with a little introduction while we give people a little time to filter in, I guess. So yeah, I was saying, so we're a student-run group. We're a mix of undergraduates, graduates, postdocs, all different levels of people at UCLA, and we do lots of different events. So we're really focused on trying to bring science into policymaking and evidence-based policy. We also do like career panels and professional development workshops and advocacy workshops and visits to local district offices and like Civics 101 type events for things that I think some of us feel like we should know, but we just kind of never learned or haven't learned since 6th grade and forgot. So we do lots of different things. Yuki, add anything if I'm forgetting. Yeah, so, okay, cool. Some people are coming in. So since we don't have that much time, I think maybe we should actually get started right away. I think I'll give a tiny bit of background on Senator Mitchell, even though I'm sure most of you already know who she is, but thank you so much for coming here today to talk to us. So Senator Mitchell has an extensive history of using data and evidence-based policy in her legislation, which is why we wanted to do this event. There's way too many to list here, but one that we particularly are interested in is a recent example is the Crown Act, which she authored, and it protects people from discrimination based on their natural hair in the workplace and schools. It's really easy to appreciate how this law can improve settings like academia and STEM, which is particularly relevant for us, where women of color continue to be marginalized in a whole host of different ways. The Crown Act was only passed a little over a year ago in California, and it was the first of its kind, and it's already similar legislation has been passed in 23 other states, which is unbelievable. So also many of us here, we had an event previously this year with Dr. Elizabeth Barnard, who is here at UCLA, and she has worked with Senator Mitchell on a piece of legislation about juvenile justice. So many of us here have heard her perspective on what it's like to work with legislators. So I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say we're really excited to hear the other side of that now and what it's like, you know, to be working with scientists and why it's so important. I think we're just going to start. I'm going to pass it off to Yuki, who's our vice president. And we also want to encourage all of you, if you have questions, please feel free to send them to me in the chat box, and then I can try and integrate them as we're as we speak, as much as time allows. So Yuki, I'll hand it off to you.
All right, thanks so much, Zoe. And yeah, thank you so much again for coming, Senator Mitchell. Yeah, so as Zoe was talking about, you have a strong record of introducing evidence-based legislation, and I'm curious about your process when it comes to creating such legislation. Does the idea for legislation precede supporting data or vice versa? So for instance, you've worked to protect minors from waiving their Miranda rights. And I was really struck to learn that up to 90% of kids in the US correctional system were coerced into waiving the Miranda rights. And that in the last 3 decades, over 70% of exonerated juveniles under 15 were found to have falsely confessed. So this data clearly communicates the necessity for your custodial interrogation law. So back to the question, when crafting legislation, what is your process when it comes to data? If relevant research does not exist, how do you approach quantifying the issue so that you can present a compelling case to your fellow legislators?
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to have this really, I think, important, timely conversation. And there isn't a single process. I think, you know, people often joke and say that policy making is really like sausage making. You like the end product, but sometimes you don't want to see it in process. And I can't say that there's one access point. There have been times that I have brought my ordinary life experience to the table. You know, the Crown Act is a perfect example in that I've been locked for a number of years, and yet in the Crown Act example, my life experience happened to mirror a research study that had been done by Dove that talked about 80% of Black women felt that they could not wear their natural hair in the workplace. And so it was this, you know, perfect alignment of stars. Literally after I made the decision, we'd begun drafting language in the bill. 1 month later, we all saw the example that the image that went viral of the young wrestler in New Jersey. I mean, literally all of that was within a 30-day period of time. And so sometimes you get lucky and the stars align like that. You know, other times, I think what has happened is in my 10 years now in the legislature, it's kind of twofold. I brought my experience representing community, coming from a family. My mother was a prison warden at the California Institution for Women. I worked for a brief spell as an undergrad in juvenile hall in Riverside. You know, my mother was a trained social worker, so that was the lens by which she experienced her entire career in probation and correction. So that was kind of my orientation. And so coming to the legislature, I introduced a couple of bills early on, the Parity in Sentencing Act for crack and powder cocaine. And I think the stakeholders thought, hey, we have someone here who gets it, who's sympathetic. And so then that kind of attracts attention and support from the myriad of wonderful organizations now, particularly in the criminal justice and juvenile justice kind of right-sizing community, who, based on research, based on people who were systems touched, have found each other, learned how to be advocates, and are bringing amazing ideas and suggestions to the table. You know, from the law school clinics to all of the advocacy groups, the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, ARC in LA, to the Youth Justice Coalition. It's this wonderful collection of both people bringing their ordinary life experience to the table and researchers, academicians, who are also publishing amazing volumes of data that, you know, from my perspective, we're supposed to take action on. They shouldn't just sit on shelves. We should use them as policymakers to validate and instruct and redirect and newly inform our policymaking process. And so, you know, sometimes I drive the train, people find me. Sometimes I read a study, we see a nugget in there, and then we go talk to the stakeholders and bring the coalitions together.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. So our next question, we wanted to talk a little bit about Measure J, which I know you have endorsed. So decades of research demonstrates that incarceration can disrupt generations of healthcare access, educational attainment, economic prospects, and the cost is not at all justified by the proportionate improvements in recidivism rates or public safety outcomes. So currently 42% of the county budget is allocated to law enforcement and the legal system. And you've endorsed Measure J, which is the LA County initiative that would commit 10% of the county budget from local tax revenue to community investment and alternatives to incarceration. Since county budgeting is one of the responsibilities of the Board of Supervisors, we wanted to hear your opinion on all of that, and we were wondering if it's the Board of Supervisors that will then decide exactly how to allocate that 10%, and if so, an overhaul of the public safety and justice system seems like a momentous undertaking, and we wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about how you would approach that responsibility and what experts you might have help you in that.
I appreciate that. You know, I'm actually a candidate now for LA County Board of Supervisors. And one of the reasons I am interested and wanted to make that transition personally was because of the role of the county. The county is the safety net. That's the safety net level of government. And I'm proud of some of the actions this current sitting board has taken to really begin to shift their lens, to shift to focus more so on the help and hope aspects of supporting people in crisis, as opposed to the prosecution and incarceration, right? And I think the percentage of the budget that, as you just talked about, that's been spent on policing is a reflection of where we've been, and Measure J is a reflection of where we now intend to go. That shift of funding on the front end to support community in a meaningful way, which will kind of naturally reduce our need for investment on the back end. You know, the criminal justice system has become this interesting kind of backstop, literally a backstop, that is catching people that other systems have failed. A failed mental health system, a failed educational system, a failed child protective services system. And so that's why, you know, the LA County Men's Jail is considered one of the largest mental health facilities in the country, because we are failing to meet the needs of people. And as a result, they are falling into the criminal justice system. Measure J gives us an opportunity to rethink that and invest on the front end. I thrilled and enthusiastically support Measure J. I think it's important, however, that people recognize that that 10% set aside should not be perceived as the ceiling. In my humble opinion, it should be perceived as the floor. And the Board of Supervisors has this opportunity to stand up these systems so we can avoid this natural backstop of the criminal justice system. So to stand up and fund community intervention, mental health services, stand up and fund true prevention, working both with community-based organizations and government entities that need to do a better job in terms of prevention and redirection and support of people, as opposed to waiting for the backstop to catch them. So yes, it would be the board's responsibility and opportunity to do what county government should be designed for and was intended for, which was to create this safety net to catch people and support them versus force them into this backstop.
Thank you. Yeah, I really liked how you said it was the opportunity of the Board of Supervisors in addition to the responsibility. So a lot of what you were saying just now about like the safety net and the, you know, sometimes catching the failures of other systems. So that kind of goes into my next question, but I'm going to be focusing it on women's health. And yeah, so when I ask about equity in women's health, you know, this conversation is often dominated by the politicization of reproductive care, but of course, as you're aware, encompasses so much more than that. And then the outcomes are often shaped by institutional racism and generational trauma. And then, you know, resulting patterns of substance abuse, school dropouts, unplanned pregnancies, and incarceration all threaten a woman's bodily autonomy and economic freedom. So for example, the Los Angeles Star Court is a specialized court for victims of child sex trafficking. And the court has reported that 80% of the girls have been in the child welfare system, and that 90% are Black, and 9% have engaged in substance use, which is a characteristic coping mechanism to survive and recover from sexual trauma.
Exactly.
So yeah, so it's evident that the effects of systemic racism on women's health are immense, but you've been able to enact significant progress in California by addressing racial disparities, for example, in maternal health care. And so within, you know, the context of what's happening in our country and our state and our city, as county supervisor, how would you approach protecting the health and future of young women in Los Angeles?
I appreciate that question. And I think it goes back to not only my focus on the maternal morbidity of Black women, but also, as you talked about, child victims of sex trafficking. I carried a very controversial bill that decriminalized prostitution for victims of sex trafficking, minor victims of sex trafficking. You know, policymaking and politics together can sometimes get very interesting. That was a very clear policy for me, that if I'm under 18, I can't consent to sex, and therefore, how could I be charged with prostitution? And the district attorneys and law enforcement all claimed that that was the only stick, if you will, they had to protect female victims of sex trafficking. And it occurred to me one day, literally in the policy committee hearing, when they were saying that, I said, you know, it would never occur to us to charge a victim of domestic violence with battery or a rape victim with prostitution. They're victims. And so why is it okay here? No, Mr. Law Enforcement, you can remove a young woman from a dangerous circumstance under the Welfare and Institutions Code. So it's not about incarcerating her and charging her with a crime is the only way to get her out of a dangerous situation. But that goes back to your point about bias, implicit and explicit. And I think the perception that these young women were in the life because they chose to, and that somewhere along the line, they really did commit a crime. So it was okay to charge them with prostitution. And so what was important about that bill was thinking about what the alternative system therefore would be. Because remember, we're trying to avoid this backstop. And it falls in the county level to make sure that through the county child welfare services division, that we are setting up a foster care system that's relevant to what kids are experiencing today. That's not an antiquated system, that really provides focused, supportive, nurturing environments for young women and men who experience that trauma, and how to get them through that and protect them from people who are going to continue to come after them and exploit them. I have had conversations with group home providers, wonderful group home providers in my Senate district, who will talk about the girls leaving for school one morning and no one coming back after school, that they are preyed upon by people who exploit them, to go find them at school, offer them money. Just, it's a horrible dynamic. And so the county level is the space where we could create this new kind of programming to support them in a meaningful way. I think it's that kind of lens to be relevant and current and understand the challenges that women and women of color and girls are experiencing today, and to be true to myself and stand in my truth and be willing to be the face and the advocate. You know, a couple of my Republican colleagues, with regard to the decriminalization of prostitution for victims of sex trafficking, turned the language of that bill and suggested to the conservative media that I had legalized prostitution. And so that led to a whole different conversation about how this is an entire population that they were just going to deny and assume that I had done the latter. And so, you know, it's a constant struggle. It's important to work with survivors groups to bring their story and truth to the forefront, and then have the courage to stand your ground and say, that is not what I'm doing. This is what we're doing, and these young women deserve to be protected.
Thank you so much. Yes, and now I'm pivoting a little to like environmental justice, which feels very strange after that question and answer, but we know, so Los Angeles has lots of issues with poor air quality. It's the largest urban oil field in the country, with many residents living within a quarter mile of an oil well. It's also home to some of the largest methane gas leaks in the country, among other issues. As a state senator, you introduced a fracking ban for the state of California, and it failed to pass.
Yes.
So we were wondering what you think is holding back the state of California from making similar environmental policies, especially in a state that kind of says it's so progressive, and how we as scientists can support your efforts for achieving environmental protections.
So before I forget, because I'm old and I'll forget, you know, I want to make sure you all know about the science fellowship that the legislature offers. Okay, great, beautiful.
But feel free to tell us about it anyway. But
okay,
I'm sure.
Just briefly, there are several professional fellowships that are offered in the legislature through the executive branch, the judicial. There's a fellowship. The Senate and the Assembly have fellowships. And then there's this Science Fellows program that's amazing, that brings scientists to the policymaking arena. I've hosted several Science Fellows over the course of my career who had PhDs in areas of science that I didn't know existed. It's been amazing. I've got a Science Fellow currently on the budget staff. And so it really is a practical way that you can apply your research, your field of study directly to policymaking. When we think about the value of Science Fellows, have had not only in the Natural Resources Committee and Health Committee, some of the kind of logical areas, but in some other areas. In fact, I've got a former Science Fellow that we then hired on the Public Safety Committee, on Budget Committee, who focuses on public safety, and we have a current Science Fellow. So please look it up, look up the information. You can Google it. I just want to make sure that it's on your radar screen.
And also, just while we're saying that, we're also, for the people here in attendance, we're going to be having a meeting in a few weeks with the recruitment person for the Science Fellows. So
Excellent.
if that sounds cool to you, make sure to read our emails. Thanks.
Right, read the email. It's an amazing opportunity. The fellowships are all pretty consistent. It's a 1-year paid internship where you actually are placed in an office in Sacramento doing policy making. My science fellows have always carried legislation, staff legislation. Some of them have brought ideas to the table, but you are a legislative aide for the course of a year. So it's an amazing experience and opportunity. You know, we've made a huge transition when I first introduced my hydraulic fracturing bills, 2 of them, 9, 10 years ago. We have a new administration. He's taken drastic measures just in this last week, where he wants by, I think it's 2030, you know, all electric cars in California. He's asking the legislature to bring forward legislation to ban fracking in California. He's re-envisioned DOGGR, the state agency that oversees. So we are in such a different place than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And there are so many issues that are impacting the second supervisorial district, to concerns around the Bayona wetlands, to true brownfields throughout South LA, to water quality. You know, I went to a public hearing a number of years ago where residents in Watts, you know, brought plastic bottles filled with their tap water that looked like mud. And so while we think, you know, Flint, Michigan is over there, it's really not. And the hundreds of communities in California that don't have access to clean, safe drinking water is mind-blowing. So we have lots of work to do here, but I feel very good about how we have moved as a state, how the environmental justice movement has had impact, quite frankly, on public opinion and policymakers. There was a LA Times full-page ad taken out maybe last week or so, I think in response to the governor's most recent action, that really talks about this tension between, you know, low-income communities that are always disproportionately impacted by the negative impacts of environmental racism. But, you know, there's this black and white kind of notion that if we are moving towards environmental safety measures, then, you know, poor people are disproportionately impacted, that's who can't afford the electric vehicle. Those are the jobs that will go away. And so we have to work collectively to begin to dispel some of those myths, to talk about what a Green New Deal for LA County would really be and what it would really look like, and how we help transition communities and labor into the direction of the future for California. So we're in a new place, and I'm very proud to have been an early victim of the beat up around fracking. But it's important, you know, to have a canary in the mine, to go out first, test the waters, lose your front teeth because you can't even get the bill out of the house of origin. But it has created a space for an ongoing conversation. It's created, when you have those vehicles early, it creates an opportunity for the community to organize around them, and then stay organized and continue to create kind of public momentum to get us to the place where we are today, where a governor comes in and says, of course, that makes perfect sense, and makes it so through executive order. So we've come a long way.
Thanks. Yeah, so our next question, I guess, is about your network of legislators. So you've talked about a bit some resistance from your fellow legislators while you were in the state. And then you've talked about the resources that were available to you through the S&T Fellowship. So the Board of Supervisors is 5 people. So in terms of your relationship with the legislative body that you're working with, and then also the resources of scientists that are available to you, like how do you imagine that shift going, the challenges and the benefits that might come along with it?
Oh, I think, I think it's my orientation. It's how I view healthy community-based policy making, So whatever office I am going to look for opportunities to bring people in, you know? I recognize in the second district, we have a wealth of academic institutions. You know, there's this whole new bioscience oriented industry that's coming into Culver City and just outside of Culver City. And so I know that there will always be resources available to me, not only in the second district, but countywide. I had a chat just last night with Dr. Michael Drake, the 21st president newly installed of the UC system. Met last week with the brand new chancellor of the CSU system. Not to mention the University of Southern California and Mount St. Mary's are in my Senate district. And so I've got ongoing relationships with institutions of higher learning. And there's a vested interest for them to have placement for students, for their professors and students to have an opportunity to see their research come to fruition in the body of policymaking. And so that's what I will always look to and always do, just because I get the value and understand that those resources are available to me, whether it's in a structured fellowship like I've experienced and benefited from here in the legislature, or if it's something that I have to create once I join the board of if I join the board of supervisors.
Thank you so much. So one question that someone has from, I don't know if you use the word audience on a Zoom webinar, but from the audience is, what's the ratio of time that you and your science fellows spend split between Sacramento and your home district?
So for the legislators, we are one of few full-time legislatures in the country. California, New York, very few others. Like Texas isn't even a full-time legislature. And so we are in session. What does it mean when I say full-time? We are in session January through the fall, every day of the week. As budget chair, I work all the time. And so floor sessions are Monday and Thursday, committee sessions Tuesday through Wednesday. So we're in our district offices on Fridays, doing district events on the weekends, back to Sacramento on Mondays. For the fellows, they're largely in Sacramento because they're doing direct policy work. My staff in the district office are primarily doing constituent services. And so the fellows don't split their time like the members do.
Cool, thank you. Someone else wanted to know how common it is for legislators to value research-backed legislation. And would you say that you're an outlier in valuing science-based policy, or do many of your fellow senators approach legislation with the same considerations?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an outlier. I would say many do. And it's not only legislators. There's a whole, I worked for the legislature for many years. I lobbied for the Western Center on Law and Poverty, but I was a consultant to the Senate Health and Human Services Committee. And so I would encourage everyone, when we're done with today's Zoom, to Google Senate Budget Committee, Google Senate Health Committee, Public Safety, Labor, whatever your interest may be, and look at one of the committee analyses. There is an entire staff. The Senate has 900 employees. There's an entire staff of subject matter experts who analyze in depth every piece of legislation that's introduced that goes before a committee. And so it's not just whether or not we value it, it's these consultants who look to research to inform their analysis of bills that come through the process. And so there are points, numerous points along how a bill becomes a law or how a budget is developed process where research and science comes into play. But just, look at a committee analysis so you can get a flavor. These analyses are pages and pages that give us pros, cons, their analysis of the impact of the legislation. It gives you historical reference in terms of why the current law is, why they think we need to move in the direction that the bill suggests or not. And so it's a whole group of people who rely on science in the public policy arena, in addition to legislators.
Great, thank you. So we also wanted to ask about another environmental issue. So we know that LA imports around 80% of its water from other areas, and it's one of the 5 driest big cities in the country. We also know that things like old infrastructure can lead to contaminated water and old piping and contaminated wells, and these are all really big issues in LA. We wanted to know what mechanisms or steps can be taken by the Board of Supervisors to aid in more sustainable and safe sourcing of water.
You know, it's about resources. And like you said, we've got a very, very old infrastructure, and infrastructure projects are the first thing you punt in times of economic crises. So I've served in the legislature now during a recession and through the recovery where we had resources. And that was the first thing we did. We tried to fund and pay for those big infrastructure projects that we kind of kicked the can on for far too long. You can see it most relevant in the legislature in terms of our roads. When I saw the list of unsafe bridges and overpasses in California, it took my breath away. And so we were able to pass SB1 and create a unique funding source. We wouldn't be in this position again where that kind of infrastructure development would continue to get ignored because we were broke. So SB1, which created an additional tax on gasoline, because all of us use the roads if we've got gas-powered vehicles, and then had to figure out a way to create a tax, if you will, for those who are driving electric vehicles because they drive it on the same infrastructure. And so it's that kind of action that government bodies can take. We've got to figure out funding streams and create a plan to invest long-term in that infrastructure. You know, infrastructure like in your house, it's not sexy. You can't see plumbing and the electrical, but that's the fundamental role of government. That's what we rely on government to do in terms of those infrastructure projects that are regional, that benefit the entire citizenry. And so it's divided by level of government, who has a responsibility for doing what. A lot of funds come from the federal government down to be implemented in the local community. And so the Board of Supervisors has a responsibility to talk about funding and to create a priorities in terms of how we create new important opportunities and how we prioritize it. You know, for me, the true definition of politics is the process by which we decide who gets what when. And why, for me, representing the community that I do is so important, because, you know, vulnerable communities and disenfranchised communities are sometimes the communities that are overlooked, because they may not know how to advocate or rattle the cages or know the processes we talked about earlier about who your elected official is and those pressure points. And so that's why community activism and me working with community is so important to me, because that's ultimately what led me to decide to run for office, to represent those needs and interests.
Thanks. Yeah, I think you're inspiring a lot of people in the audience because we're getting some questions about how to get involved. So we're having questions about, so as you mentioned, in your experience with the legislature, do members of the County Board of Supervisors consult science? Oh wow, I think that one literally just came in while I was talking and it moved. Okay, I was starting with the, do you have advice for graduate and postdoctoral students if they're doing research that they think is relevant to active legislation? How do they share it? And what is the best way to reach out to your local representatives to express your opinions and hopefully influence them into the will of the people? So that was 2 questions I merged together, and there's more coming.
Well, first of all, it's really important that you do that. You know, as I mentioned how I split my time between Sacramento and my district office, I've got a full staff in the district office, and I'm there at least on Fridays. And then during breaks, during interim, our fall recess, which is now, we're in the district office. We've got a spring recess and a summer recess. And so calling those district offices, calling the district office and say, hey, I'm a doctoral student at UCLA, had this idea about blah, blah, blah. Who in your office do I talk to about environmental justice, public health, whatever the case is? I think people oftentimes want to get to the legislator because they think that's their only access point, and it's not. I think having been former staff, I am so sensitive to people overlooking the incredible value of staff. And so reach out and try to get audience with them. They too are experts in terms of helping you navigate the process, helping you say, this is a great idea, but you know, she's a state senator and the state doesn't have oversight over that area. Think about calling your city council person to help guide you to wherever you need to be. They're a wonderful, wonderful resource. So please, you know, figure out. I won't ask if everybody on the Zoom knows who their assembly person and senator is. I won't embarrass us, but let's start by figuring out who your representative is and reach out to them. I think it's very important. Give me the other piece of the question again. That was how to connect.
I think that was a
that it?
comprehensive response to the whole question. Yeah.
That's really important. And you know, I think it's really important, and I would really encourage you to look at these fellowships. If you have a real desire in learning this process too, to figure out how you can be effective, to learn how you may frame your research, not to influence the outcome, but to how to frame your research such that it is truly relevant and timely and is bringing forward a solution to a current emerging problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Having these ongoing conversations, these fellowships, I think are just, you know, the value is it can't be qualified in terms of how rich the experience really would be. And I just can't express more strongly the impact you have on your state. You know, there are about 4,000 bills that are introduced every session. You know, we're a bicameral house of the legislature. The Assembly has 80 members, the Senate has 40. So when you think about, since statehood, you know, the number of people who served in office, the number of staff, you know, the number, it's really a finite number of people who can say, I've had a direct experience, I've had a direct opportunity to influence a law that impacts 40 million people today and into the future. That's not chopped liver.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yes, so someone else was wondering how long it takes usually for funding changes to happen. So for instance, if Measure J passes, how long will it actually take for communities to feel any sort of effect from it?
So excellent question. And I'll give you an example that we're experiencing right now. Measures H and HHH. Those were the two initiatives that the city and the county got on the ballot and passed to address the in-house. The city's initiative was to create a funding source to build permanent supportive housing, and the county's role was to raise funds to provide the supportive services in the permanent supportive housing. And so people are saying, stopping me on the street every day, hey, I voted for H and HHH, and there's still unhoused people on my block. You know, what's happening? And so I think when we vote for it, we expect instantaneous improvement. And there's lots of press, and Ron Galperin, the city controller, has issued a report saying that, you know, Measure H is going to raise X number of dollars, but the per housing unit cost for new construction is something astronomical, like $500,000 a unit. So the money is not going to stretch as far as we need it to house the 60,000, conservatively speaking, homeless people today. So I offer that example to suggest that it's not going to happen overnight. I don't remember the actual language of Measure J. If it says, you know, upon passage, if it passes in November, the next budget cycle, this will be, you know, what happens. You know, the budget cycles, it happens once a year, and they're finished with the budget already this year. So that wouldn't even take effect into budget planning for the following year. And so planning has to go involved, where we fall in the budget season, if you will, all comes into play.
Great. So I think we're almost running out of time. Just to finish, someone asked, which I think is a great question for the last question, if you have a favorite piece of legislation that you've ever authored and why it would be your favorite. Or just one you really like, or anything you want to tell us.
I appreciate that. I've introduced, I think we've done the calculation. 118 bills. 90 of them have become law. So I have a pretty good batting average, if I may say so myself. And that is due in large part to an amazing team of deeply committed public servants who share my core values about what Californians deserve and are entitled to. So I tip my hat to my team. And I can't say that I have a favorite. There have been moments, there have been bills that I've had to work on for years and years and years. There have been budget strategies. It's not just legislation, but I chair budget committee. So I use the budget process as a tool to bring resources and direct resources to vulnerable people. And so there have been budget strategies. There was one in particular. I wrote my first letter to the editor 25, 30 years ago on this issue as a young staffer. It was something called the Maximum Family Grant. Republicans were in charge of Congress, and there was, we were criminalizing poverty and criminalizing poor women. And they assumed that women, in order to prolong their welfare benefit, would just continue to have babies. A racist, classist policy. This whole notion of the quote, welfare queen. And so Maximum Family Grant was actually a ballot initiative in California that failed. The voters didn't buy it. Maximum Family Grant said that if you were on CalWORKs on welfare and you had another baby, your grant wouldn't expand based on your family household getting larger. That was their effort to stop you from having babies, to prolong your welfare check. There was a ballot initiative and the voters of California said, no, we don't support that. And a budget deal in the cover of night that the Republicans put forward created Maximum Family Grant. The average family household for people on welfare is the same as everybody else, like 2.1 children. There was no empirical data to suggest that poor people have larger families. It just wasn't. It is the single that economists have suggested. Asha Bromsky brought this to me. It is the single policy that they are able to identify that helped drive our child poverty rate at record heights in California when they passed the Maximum Family Grant. The average CalWORKs grant is about $550 for a family of 3 per month. And when we got rid of the Maximum Family Grant, that added like $119 to your grant. So my argument always has been, there is no woman, and the woman has not been born, that would have a baby for an extra $119 a month. That is just a false narrative. And so I wrote a letter to the editor as a young staffer when Maximum Family Grant passed, because I was found it so offensive. That was about the same time of the first kind of multiple births, that first family that had, 7 babies at a time. And the whole world opened up to them. They got minivans and college scholarships. And the focus of my letter to the editor was, oh, okay, poor women, take note. If you have all your babies at once, the world will support you. But don't be poor and on welfare and have one more baby, because we will penalize you. We will call you welfare queen, da, da, da. And the Sacramento Bee published that. 25, almost 30 years later, I'm a legislator. We're talking about the child poverty rate in California. These economists and all these folks come to me to bring the data, and they point to Maximum Family Grant. I said, now's the time, we've got to overturn it. Took us 5 years to work through the policy, to combat the policy. The chair of the Republican, the state Republican party was a policymaker at the time. He's in the press saying, oh, Mitchell is bright, but they'll never overturn that policy. And we did. And for me, it was important to send a signal about, there are no queens in welfare, because you can't be a queen on $500 a month. That welfare reform had happened since then. At the federal level, thanks to Clinton. So it's time limited. You have to work, you have to be in school. And so the culture around these supportive services programs had changed. And yet that one piece of policy that was the most sexist, policy you could ever imagine was still on the books. I'm proud that I was in a position to call it out for what it was and work for a period of time to get that reversed. So I'd say maximum family grant is one example.
Amazing. I think that's the perfect way to end, right? Does anyone? Thank you so much for speaking. I think clearly from the amount of questions, as Yuki said, a lot of people were inspired to get more involved. So if you guys are, feel free to reach out to us as a group or to me or Yuki. We do lots of events and things and trainings and fellowships and yeah, with the goal of bringing more scientists into policy and helping scientists who are interested be able to have an effect on policy. So reach out to us, and thank you again, Senator Mitchell. That was so great.
Thank you for the invitation. I appreciated the opportunity to kind of engage in this conversation, and again, hope that people will look to your training and the opportunities for these internships. You know, California is the 5th largest economy in the world, 40 million residents, so many opportunities for you to use your academic training and pursuits to really help inform policymaking in the great state of California. And so I hope that you'll take full advantage of those opportunities.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye. Yeah, so if anyone who's still here has any questions, feel free to email us at uclascipolgroup@gmail.com. And thank you guys for coming. Bye.